Thank you all. Good evening. It's fun for me to be here with all of you, having been a part of this board for so long. And it's especially fun to sit down with these two men because I've known them both for a long time. As many of you probably already know, I worked for Mark for many years in the 90s, and he's been a wonderful mentor to me over the years since. And Russell and I actually go back even farther, having met, I think, in the late 80s when we were both at the same office together. And we've been good friends for all the years since. So it's been a lot of fun for me to be part of this. And interesting, I think, to have this moment to sit down with them after all these years and talk about the trajectory of their careers, their education, and what that's meant to them, and maybe how that might have some relevance to what all of you as board members are thinking about with respect to the Institute. So having said all that, I thought I'd kick things off by asking a slightly offbeat question, which is about your first architectural memory. What was the first building or place or architectural experience that made an impression on you? And I'll start with you.
The 1964 World's Fair in New York City, with the Empire State Building and the excavation for the World Trade Center, all in the same trip.
Wow.
But I'd say really the strongest impression was the homestead, the place that I grew up as a child. It was a farm. There are numerous buildings. You know, there's hundreds of acres, groves of trees, tracks that go here and there, water tower, shed, barn, garage, kennel, houses. It was a village. So I was aware that, you know, buildings take certain forms, they're placed in certain arrangements, and there's a life that happens in this big ecosystem. So I'd say that was really my first architectural impression.
And then the World's Fair is, of course, completely different.
Yeah, blew it up. That took me to the future.
How old were you when you went to the World's Fair?
60, I'd be 10 years old.
Okay, interesting. Russell, what about you?
Well, my most memorable, our youngest experience really was any city. You have to know, I grew up in a town of 60 people. So anytime I would
in Texas?
Texas.
In what town?
Lasbuddy. And it's up in the Panhandle, it's really flat. And so any town I would go to at a really young age, it was just shocking to me just that there could be order and that all that stuff sort of worked out because there's just so many moving parts. And then probably architectural experience really at probably about 10 was at the University of Texas seeing Paul Cray's plan and Battle Hall. It was shocking that not only was there order, but then you could do so much more, not just organizing and making it work, but there really was something sort of more that could be achieved. So,
Did these experiences lead you to architecture school? To study architecture in school?
For me, I think yes, because I would imagine how things could be better and different in where I lived, and so yeah, I think I played around with those things in my mind's eye.
Yeah.
a little bit more random. I drew and built things growing up. I grew up in this small place. We were always in the shop making things, but I had aspirations of being an athlete, and so I was running track in college. I got really hurt. I didn't really know what to do, and I didn't know what I was going to study. My brother was studying engineering, and so he asked me what I was going to study, and I told him I didn't really know. So he said, I think you'd be a good architect. So I took him up on it and went to architecture school, and I've loved it ever since.
And that was at Texas Tech?
Yes.
And when you were in the BArch program, was there anybody there who was particularly influential? A teacher or a...
Well, there was a teacher. He was the dean at the time. His name was Dudley Thompson, and he was a planner. And but the occasion at Texas Tech, when I started, we were still in the engineering school. I was the first class that was in a standalone architecture school. It was really extremely rigorous in drawing. We had design and drafting the first semester, and then we had studio art for 2 semesters. So you really didn't take architectural design until your third studio year. And he gave this simple problem where you wrote the program, you picked the site, and you picked the building. But you had to describe how the building would function, but more importantly, you had to describe how the building was supposed to make you feel. And if you were with one person, two people, or no more than three. But so you had to write what you hoped to achieve. And so every time you were in studio, you had to pull out your brief, and he would make comments. Okay, you're supposed to feel intimate. You know, the roof is 20 feet tall. I don't think that's going to happen. And you just sort of got the idea again that there was more to it. You could control the effects.
Mark, you did a little differently where you went to college first at Carnegie Mellon and then to Princeton. Did you intend, when you went to Carnegie Mellon, were you already thinking, I'm going to study architecture there, or?
So I have 2 professional degrees. So yes, I completed a 5-year program at Carnegie Mellon and a 1.5-year program at Princeton. It was completely gratuitous, bit of education, but it satisfied my curiosity because as a young architect, you know, it's a long ladder to climb, and I couldn't find the ladder, let alone get on the first rung. So I thought slipping back into an academic environment might help me discover, you know, my aspirations, my true career aspirations. For college, I aspired to be a musician, and I got some good advice from my teachers who said, Mark, you know, you play pretty well, you're diligent, you're competent in a lot of forms of music, but it's a really difficult living to make, and you should try something that's more professionally oriented. So architecture was it. My mother's sister is an architect, so I knew that it was a profession. I had the ability to imagine things in my mind's eye and to draw them out, so that helped. But I think it's also something you take away from music is learning to work with abstract notation to create an environment. Right? So you've got bars of music, and there's a composition that has an ensemble of instruments and so forth, and you have a performance. And in a way, architecture is like that, although we get a lot of second chances. We have erasers. Musicians don't have erasers. They get one chance.
Well, you can perform it again.
Right.
Between Carnegie Mellon and Princeton, were there particular people? I know at Princeton you've talked about people that were very influential on you. At Carnegie Mellon, were there particular professors that had an impact on you? There
were a lot of people that came through the school. The dean at the time, Delbert Highlands, not a well-known figure, a local architect in Pittsburgh, very charismatic individual. He taught the first 2 semesters of architecture. He approached it in a very abstract way. I didn't learn any answers, but I learned a lot of questions, and I learned how to ask questions. That did not permeate the rest of my studio education. It was pretty much a mishmash, depending on the adjunct professor's interest of the time. So some were more oriented toward design process, becoming a creative person. Others were more enigmatic about how creativity occurred and how you evaluated good and bad. But what did happen, projects got bigger and bigger, more complicated. But the school had a philosophy that there were 3 prongs to a young architect's education. And one was history, one was technology, and the other was design. And they were to be given equal weight. So there were a lot of trips to steel mills and concrete factories and that kind of thing, as well as learning how to size a beam.
Was that history?
That was
steel mills?
It was still there at my time. And they had 4 historians on staff, so there was a plethora of history classes that one could take, and then design studio.
Did you have much history in your program?
You know, we had basic history, but it wasn't memorable. It was nothing I really taken away from it. Yeah. It all sort of came later, again through this dean, Dean Thompson, as a planner. He sort of brought the first book of Leon Creer into the school, and you know, one of our projects was to design an architecture school. So shortly after that, we got the book, I decided to design mine as a city, or as a main street, basically, which was not very popular. But it was, I found myself always sort of bucking the system to a certain degree, because it seemed what we were being taught and how to evaluate things, it just didn't make any sense. And I either thought I shouldn't be an architect, or there's got to be another way, because what everyone was describing as good and why it was good made no sense to me. Early on, it didn't seem logical.
When you went to Princeton, Graves was there. Was the point of view at Princeton different from Carnegie Mellon's, or
No,
was
I
it
think
an extension of the same thinking? Or
That's interesting. I don't know that Carnegie Mellon had a point of view. I think it really tried to open doors. It had a very robust lecture, guest studio, instructor program, so everybody came through the school. So Leon Creer's there in 1975, Bob Stern is there, Colin Rowe is there, Fred Coder, the whole group. So I was exposed to what I believe to be the best and brightest thinkers and practitioners of the day. And so you have a diversity of ideologies, a diversity of design styles, a diversity of interests, and you had to choose. You had to figure out what path you wanted for yourself. And so finding my voice and finding an idea or two that would sort of pull me along, would be a way to continue to think about architecture and design. I left school with that project to find those two things. And going to Princeton, I think helped me sort of recognize what was important to me, although it took me another 5 years in practice to actually find a way to start doing it, to start practicing it. So my interest in traditional architecture and in classical, enduring design principles, not the movement so much, modernism as a way of constantly challenging, deconstructing, shedding the past, I wanted to get off that train, and I wanted to work with something where the ideas were static. And so I think Michael Graves found that. He went to Rome and he came back and he said, columns and walls and openings and axes and hierarchies, these are the tools of an architect. And they were then and they are now. And that resonated with me. I think the thing that I really struggled with and took another 5 or 6 years to figure out was how you imbue buildings with character. So organization, the abstract bit was easy. That's kind of the modernist way, and you spend architects are abstract in the way that they think. But how you give something color, ambiance, associations with other things. In architecture school, that's poo-pooed. That's populist. It's also emotional. It's conventional. It's not considered deep. And so that's something that took time for me to try to figure out how I was going to approach that, because every building, no matter how abstract, has character.
Right. But when you left thinking you were really interested in shingle style, which is fairly specific.
Yeah, I don't really know where that started, but whenever we always looked at magazines, and something about the shingle style, it just was American. It was picturesque and beautiful, but it was logical and it made sense to me. And it fit in the landscape, and I really hadn't traveled much to the east, but it fit in. And it was like a light bulb went off, and I couldn't explain why, but I was extremely drawn to it, and it felt like I felt like I understood it, even though I didn't, or I could come to understand it. So as soon as I got out of architecture school, I came to the East Coast, and I interviewed between Boston and New York in 18 places in 10 days. And I ended up working for Robert Orr in New Haven. And it was well, I actually worked for 3 months at one place because they wanted a designer. And I thought I was pretty much ready to design things and had a vision of the way buildings should be, only to, right out of school with no experience. And so after 3 months, I realized that I did not know that, and I wasn't really interested in learning what they were doing. So Robert and Melanie were still together then, and they had offered me a position, so I called them up and asked if I could go to work there. And the first project I worked on with them was Mashpee Commons with Andreas and Liz, and so we got to work on the town planning component of it, and then we did sort of the first building. And I was there for maybe 6 months with one other architect and working with Robert and Melanie all night. And it was just an opportunity, just through hard work, to be side by side with them, talking about architecture, pulling out books, going through precedent. And it really was, I think, design-wise, really on-the-job training, learning from them. And they were very giving with information, participated. They, really, because of their relationship with Andreas and Liz, had this urban component that I was interested in, but architects, and Melanie loved gardens. And so, I spent all my time in their office or their library or seeing New England. And so this notion of curiosity and just being in a place and seeing architecture that fit its landscape was really where I think I learned, to break down architecture and to understand what makes it good and not so good. And you learn proportioning systems and all those things that we talk about now. I basically stumbled into or was led through work and curiosity.
And you went from Princeton to work for Diller and Scofidio, I think was your first job, right? So quite a change from what you do now. How was that? What was that like? What was that office like?
I needed a job, and they needed help. So it was the three of us, and we worked out of their loft. They were still teaching part-time at Cooper Union, so they were absent from the office a lot of the time. They had one active client, with a couple of houses in Tuxedo Park that needed to be altered in one way or another. And there was a lot of time spent on design. We had lunch together practically every day. So in a way, I had a parallel experience where I had mentors of a sort. We were in it together. Mm-hmm. At the end of a year or so, it got a little tired because nothing was being built. It was just the three of us having lunch. They had recently received a phone call from an old client of theirs who owned a small house designed by Ernest Flagg up in Croton. And they said, we really don't know how to approach this building, but we'd love to introduce you to this client. And, why don't you take this with you? So I did do that. So that was maybe my first experience working with a traditional building.
And then ultimately you ended up at Parrish Hadley. How was that? Talk a little bit about that and what you learned there in that context.
I learned that there are parts of the world where modernism never happened. That the sense of tradition, of ideas that never change, was alive and well there. It was a shock to me. We didn't have to reinvent everything. There were a lot of received notions about what's good and beautiful. And it accorded with my interests. The buildings that they found admirable and suitable for making beautiful environments were the kind of buildings that I liked. And I was beginning to discover the great generation of architects from the 20s and 30s, starting to collect those books. And Parrish Hadley was a warm environment for caring about these kinds of buildings. So I didn't have to be critical. I didn't have to be up in my ivory tower sort of challenging received notions. I could actually just accept them for what they are and then design, make beautiful things.
I think you learn so many different kinds of things in the work environment than you do at school. It's a completely different body of knowledge. I think sometimes school is more theoretical, and then you have to really grapple with the practical in work. When you started your own practices, what from your work education impacted how you thought about the way you were going to start your practice? Mark, you came out of Parrish Hadley when you were 34 and started your own firm. Was that a natural progression from Parrish Hadley, or were you going to do it differently?
It was a very natural progression because I had two partners and we all worked together at Parrish Hadley, and we were a team of maybe 6 people all together there, 6 architects. So we had been doing this for a while together. And we were responsible for everything, which is exactly how it worked at Parrish Hadley. So as we built our staff, we looked for people that had ability and interest in all aspects of practice. So we said, we're building a core of generalists. We're not going to have departments like big corporate firms where there's a design team and a production team and a management team. It's going to be an integrated process. And I guess that's the big takeaway from Parrish Hadley is decoration, architecture, landscape design, artisan, the contribution of artisans. It's one holistic enterprise, and you risk missing opportunities to put it in silos.
Russell, you after Melanie's, you were at John Simpson, and then you started your own practice with Bill Curtis, your partner, when you were just 29. Did you feel ready?
Well, I needed a job, and when I was working for John, it was a bad time in England, so I was not ever going to get a work visa, and I felt ready. I didn't know what I didn't know, which is sort of a good place to be when you're going out on your own, and. We met and we both were hungry, and he had worked at Hartman Cox for a long time with Anki, and so it was nice to be in Houston, a place where there is some lasting traditional architecture, but not a lot, and so some people think it's odd that we practice there, but this like-mindedness, we thought about the design process in a similar way. And we had 3 simple principles that we still use today, and that is we want to enjoy going to work every day and like the people and the projects we're working on. We want to make buildings that we're proud of, that we want to say we designed and executed those buildings, and we need to make a living. And so it's real simple, and today we still, when there's a big issue, we fall back onto those 3 things and say, is this accomplishing at least 2 out of 3. We'd like to be 3 out of 3. And we've just sort of pulled ourselves up, and we've had the great fortune of being in a city where there's enough people that appreciate traditional architecture, and we have some nice neighborhoods that the fabric, people want to continue. And so, we didn't really come at building a practice. We've just really worked hard at making great buildings, and it's worked out.
Your firms have grown a lot since those early days. Yours is 80 plus, and yours is in the mid-20s, I think. Maybe not the largest it's been, but besides the size, what evolutions have happened in your firms or in your firm's work over the course of these years since you started your practices?
I think the work has stayed the same. The design principles, the aspirations have remained exactly the same as day one. But what you find is that you are building an organization, an entire culture. And as it grows bigger and bigger, you recognize that you have to nurture it in different ways. And so that's my biggest lesson is building an office culture. The design work is the same. We still talk about it a lot. We still work in small teams. We look at the library. We travel. We have the same expectations of ourselves for the quality of the building, but it's building those relationships within the office that I think we've spent the most time on.
How important is size to your businesses, to success?
I think the best work gets done in small teams with where there are primary responsibilities but loose boundaries, ambiguous boundaries between those responsibilities. So I always say we have a manager, we have a designer, and we have the production person. But the production person actually might design something, and the manager might make a drawing. So, so primary responsibilities means that people take ownership of things. Loose boundaries mean that there's redundancy, and the best idea usually rises to the top.
How about you?
I expected your office to have a lot more order than that.
There's a whole structure that sits on top of that. But when we prosecute projects, it's a small team.
That's very much the way we work. And from employees, I hear that that's extremely frustrating. And but we sort of say, everyone finds their place. If you're a really good designer and where you have something starting, you'll probably initiate the design. If you're not quite so strong, hopefully you're good at DD, or you're technically skillful and could put drawings together. And it is a team, small teams, and everyone knows where they stand and what their role is by what they're being asked to do. And I continually hear from employees that they want more structure, and they want to know what their position is and what their role is and be more defined. And it's been a hard thing for me. I'm right in the middle of writing job descriptions for all the different positions in our firm, and I've written this 10 times, and I really ended up just defining how I think a young architect should evolve to be a principal, and just made the skill sets and then put a name on it. And someone recently asked me, well, Curtis and Windham will never have another partner, so is this kind of a dead-end road? And I said, I feel completely comfortable that there'll be a partner one day. To which they're like, well, so how do I get here? And how do you define that role? And I said, in my opinion, a partner is someone that I can't do without their skills and their abilities. And I've only met 1.5 of those so far, and nobody else I can't live without. So people don't accept that description very much.
Well, so what do you guys look for in a potential architect to hire for your offices?
Somebody who gets along with other people, somebody who's interested in learning, somebody with some talent that's going to be applicable to making buildings. They might be they might be talented as a designer, but not necessarily. Design talent's a rare thing, so usually people come with other talents. The ability to work hard.
How important is a classical education to someone in your staff, to being on your staff?
I want to answer that other question because I thought about it a little bit. And Bill and I go through this, what are we looking for and how do you find them? The single most important thing we came to this conclusion is passion. And it doesn't even, they don't have to come to you with passion for architecture. Certainly they need to be interested, but if they have some other aspect in their life where they are passionate or they've become an expert at something and they're interested in architecture and they have a high GPA, we will take them. We have more Eagle Scouts in our firm than we have Notre Dame grads. We have more we have equal NCAA athletes and architects that went to Notre Dame. And that is far more, from Notre Dame, we have people every once in a while with really great skill. But I think because it's a a difficult university to get into, you immediately have people who work hard and ultimately caring, and it's that passion to work hard is what makes the difference. They don't need any classical experience. Some classical experience is nice, but the passion and the drive is far more important in our office.
So that's key to being a good architect,
Yeah.
is passion. Would you expand on that definition of a good architect? What makes a good architect?
It's all consuming, right? You only see the world through buildings. Wherever I go, I take a vacation with my children, and it's to buildings and places. So I've been looking, even as a 18-year-old studying architecture in a professional program, I saw it as a surrogate liberal arts training. I was learning about the world, but I happened to be doing it through buildings.
My kids said the only pictures I have of them in the last 10 years, there's a corner of the building as a backdrop.
What is it that architecture students should be learning today? I mean, we're at the Institute, you're involved in teaching architecture in some way to students. What should students be learning to be good architects, to be good employees in your firms?
That's a great question, and at the Institute, we're interested in a body of ideas which we believe are enduring and unchanging, and we teach those. And I think those that's what happens at the Institute. In universities, I think you're taught questions, and you're taught how to analyze what you see going on around you. And that's the deconstruct it, find the hidden meaning of it all. And that's the way to get at what's authentic and what's real. And I think at the Institute, we think, well, maybe these things that have lasted for a long time, that's more authentic and that's real. So I think that a student, somebody who's curious about architecture and why buildings look the way they do, and would have to find some way to reconcile those two conditions. Because the constant challenging, that avant-garde movement, is something that is very present. We still live with that. We're not in a world where people think things can stop and be built around old ideas. And so I look for people that are sort of interested in the world and progressive in their thinking, but also hold some principles or some values that are, for them, unchanging. That are something that's going to help them in the future determine what's good and what's bad, to discriminate and to grow as a designer. To be able to observe closely, to choose what they like and don't like. So I think you have to have some sort of core understanding of the world.
We're going to have to wrap up soon, so I want to, obviously the Institute can't teach everything, and they can't be all things to all people, but what role should the Institute play, and this is, I guess, interesting for the whole board, I think, to ask this question, to educate a good architect, in the opinion of you two?
A systematic approach to design. That's something the Institute can do. There's a huge body of literature. There are buildings around the world. There are biographies of architects who've created these buildings. They've all, in one way or another, responded to a set of core ideas. The Institute can make that available. The Institute can open the door to that kind of training. Systematic approach to design does not happen in universities. That's what I see as the principal failure, is that it's a meandering path through one studio, one instructor with one idea about what's important and another instructor about another idea, and it never gels into something complete. But the Institute has a very clear vision of how to begin to think like a designer, how to begin making building designs, how to look at completed buildings and understand how they might work in a way that's parallel to the thing that you're creating, understanding precedent. So I think that's the contribution the Institute can make.
I think that's sort of the anchor of what we have to offer. I also think, though, that in a way we need to be all things to all people, and in the sense that we should offer the opportunity for people to see that there is another way than what's being generally. There's something different than what is always being offered to them and built today. That traditional architecture is alive. It's just as realistic today as it's ever been, and in most cases, it is the right answer. So many people out there don't know that traditional architecture isn't being practiced. They just assume it always is. And I think we need to be the body that allows those people to continue their enjoyment or education, and hopefully inspire people to go on if they want to be practicing architects, and give this supplemental education. But I really think it's not just students and practitioners that we want to teach. We really need to inspire the general public and young architects. This summer studio, it was really amazing, the quality of that group of people and how excited they got in a short amount of time. And with that enthusiasm, and if that makes a spark toward passion, the rest will take care of itself. We need to have the rest of the education available for them once they're inspired, but I almost feel like the inspiration is just as important as the hardcore process that we teach.
I'd like to open it up to the group a little bit to ask questions. If you have an opportunity to do that, I think, for a few minutes, or to bring up a topic for discussion related to this. And the question is, what is the Institute doing to bring that education to a broader, to the profession as a whole, not just to the smaller group of classicists who would maybe naturally be interested in what we have to offer?
It's a great question, and I think that we're probably more in our own bubble than we are out in the world, influencing the way instructors and universities think about architecture. We're a distinct minority, and this interest in fixed ideas in design attracts a very small group of people, and it really runs counter to the way universities are prosecuting their curriculum. It's forbidden to. It's forbidden. So I don't know. I think the most powerful thing we can do is to convene people to create a place that like-minded people, and hopefully with time, people that disagree with us come because they're curious to know what's going on, because they think we know something that they don't know. That's what I'd like to see the Institute become, is that we're doing something and we have people of a sort of standing and creativity convening at the Institute, that they've got to come find out about it. Like, I've got to go downtown to the Architectural League, who's putting on a presentation with architects that are practicing completely differently than I am, or believe they're forwarding the avant-garde movement, because I'm curious to know why they think that and why they make their buildings look like that. And so I would like the Institute to be a place where those people come because they want to know why we think the way we think.
I think, Gary, it is happening, particularly in the state chapters. I know in our state chapter in Texas, people are coming to events because we're inclusive. We have craftsmen, we go see houses, we have landscape architects and decorators in, and we're having people who just enjoy that sort of an event, and so they're coming, and they're finding out about the ICAA, why is this not an architecture school? And it's just a natural way to start that discussion. So I think really this grassroots effort through the states or through people that are not just architects is the way we spread our message, and I think our chapters have done a really great job of that. It's not just practitioners. In Texas, it's far more people, either young architects or people outside of the profession that come to our events. And so I think if we just get our message out there with interesting programs, even when they're not strictly educational, we are developing our message and getting it out to more people.
I'd like to take our message to universities, because that's where the ideological battles are fought. I remember that was the most exciting times for me, where you had the Argentinians, you know, Agreste and Gondolsonis, arguing with Delbert Hylands and Peter Atkins about how you should, you know, fundamental issues about design and what's architecture. That was exciting. People disagreed, and there were more ideologies than one could absorb and understand. And I think that that's, you know, if we can infiltrate, that's probably the wrong word, but if we can provide support, moral support, maybe intellectual support for instructors, whether they're teaching history or they're teaching design or even teaching technology in universities, and that they have a sympathy for traditional architecture, classical design principles, and that permeates their studio, and students are exposed to it, and that instructor has to defend what they're doing, and they have to defend it with, you know, the people doing something different. And the students then leave the university, maybe not committed to one ideology or another, but they know that there's more than one way of thinking about things.
And I think that Bob Stern certainly did that
Yes.
when he was at Yale
Yes.
as dean. So,
Although they tend to be in silos, right? People self-segregate. You know, you kind of, and I did that. You know, I belonged to a school of thought. You know, I was, you know, when it came time to do battle. But I think that exercise of you know, taking sides, defending your commitment to a set of ideas is something that, you know, forms your, it gives you a way to sort of, evaluate your own production. You know, you come up with design ideas, and you know, you want to do something a certain way, and if you have this set of overarching ideas, it helps you sort of direct your energy in the right way.
So the question is, what is the primary task of the chapters as distinct from the national office's tasks or roles?
That's a great subject. The chapters are the institute. The national office happens to be the first chapter. Maybe it has the most members, maybe it has the longest experience. It's produced or cultivated the most instructors. It initiates the most programs, but it's by no means the greatest producer of programs. It's no longer the sole innovator of subject matter.
I wonder whether it even now does produce the most programs. I wonder.
I don't.
Given, you know, a number of the chapter programming that I see, I think I think it's equalizing quite a bit across the country. Certainly, from what I've noticed, it may not be the same in every chapter, but I think there are certain chapters that have equally as many programs as you see here in New York.
I think what's interesting is that because the chapters are widespread, they represent a region, and we do have regional differences in our architectural heritage. And I think it's interesting when these chapters reflect that, take advantage of that, make those buildings and ideas available to other people that live in other places. So I think that's a contribution chapters can make that maybe we haven't been self-conscious about.
Yes, you know, Enki, I think that I agree with Mark. The chapters really get to know their area, their constituents, and they provide programs that they're interested in. I think the national office and organization is a place for those chapters to come together, trade ideas, and then all of us together form a voice and continue the conversation about traditional architecture and what makes it relevant going forward. I find every time we have a board meeting or an event somewhere, to be around like-minded people for a short amount of time, to hear what they're inspired by, what are their aspirations, what sort of work they're doing. Great. I don't, in Houston, outside of Bill and Stephen Fox and a handful of 2 or 3 other people, and when Alan Greenberg comes to town, we don't get to have the same conversations that I have here. And I would hope that others get the same sort of re-energizing sort of feeling when we're together. I think that's the relationship between the chapters and the national office, is that there needs to be a bigger calling where we all come together and decide, make decisions about how to move our cause forward.
Statement was that we, because we all were, many of us were trained as modernists, but somehow were inspired, that nevertheless we should try to now to get into universities. And I think that's what Mark was saying earlier, that we need to try to find a way to bring the programs or the people that are part of this organization into the university setting.
Well, it starts in small ways. We have workshops where for 2 days, 4 people will go and make presentations about current practice in traditional design and the kind of training that's available at the Institute. So that's a beginning, because there's an alumnus who's sympathetic, or there's a faculty member who's sympathetic, and that opens the door to create a 2-day event. You know, it can be expanded. It can be a deeper thing. That's our project. That's our project for the next few years.
So the question is, how does the Institute address the interior design community and education, interior design education programs in the same way? Because there's a similar need.
Encourage universities to see these disciplines as one, or as, closely allied, rather than putting them in silos. You go to interior design school to learn interior design. You go to architecture school to learn architecture. You go to landscape school to learn, these things, they have their own faculty, their own departments. They don't even exist in the same building. So it's ridiculous.
Because we practice all 3, you may slap me after this for saying this, but when we say architecture, I think of all 3 together. I don't think interior design, landscape architecture, in our office, we don't think about that. But I don't like that word design. It's so ambiguous, and I guess I'm trained as an architect, so we talk about architecture, but for me, it's all 3. And I just can't imagine how you separate the 3.
So you're the goal, but what Suzanne has described is the condition that we live with today, where it's all separated, it's all in silos, and they have nothing to do with each other, and they develop their own theories and interests, and there's tremendous overlap. You have landscape architects designing cities, you have interior designers designing buildings, you have architects decorating rooms.
Well, I think a great first step is that this group is made up of people from all those disciplines, and I think that is really wonderful and something to be maintained and encouraged. And with that, we should, getting the look from our friend over there, that we should go to dinner and continue the conversation with each other. So,
Thank you.
thank you, and thank you.
Thank you.